Thanks for coming. I'm going to talk about the next spec that's up. It's called FastFed. And what I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to spend more time talking about the motivations and the goals and here, and a little bit less of the deep tech. So to go ahead and kick that off, when I joined this, I always like to say, what's the real problem here? Like, are we solving a real problem, or are we just doing tech for its own sake? And we realized that we did have a real problem that motivated this FastFed specification. And the problem was low adoption of federation. And that can be somewhat surprising, especially at a conference like this, where you see everywhere people talking about federation and identity providers and single sign-on. It feels like this is the thing everyone's going to be doing. This is the way it works. And it turns out if you talk to some of the major identity providers, major service providers, the ones who support single sign-on through federation, the adoption rates of federation are actually very, very low. It's not surprising to see adoption rates for single sign-on of single digits. You get lucky if you get low double digits. That's a good thing. Most customers to these SaaS applications and these service providers, even if they support single sign-on through SAML or whatever, are still choosing to create another login and password. And this was sort of disheartening. All this work that people put into these specs, all these big conferences, all this push to do single sign-on and better identity management, and the vast majority of customers are just creating logins and passwords over and over and over again. So we're really asking ourselves, why is this happening? We know passwords suck. And quite simply, the fact is it's hard. And this, again, can be somewhat counterintuitive, especially for a lot of folks at a conference like this. You might have seen a lot of demos at this conference. People show how easy it is to set up single sign-on to some application or tools that make this simple. You'll see a demo. It can go by in minutes. That tends not to be the real world. These demos you're seeing are being done by people who do demos over and over and over again, and they can do it in their sleep. So let me show you, how does this actually work in the real world? So here's a real example. And for this example, if you happen to know all these concepts about SAML and federation, pretend you don't know any of that. Pretend you work for an enterprise, you're a system administrator, someone's told you need to set up single sign-on to Salesforce or Dropbox or whatever. And so you're like, okay, I think I did this once 4 months ago. And so I picked Google as an example. My apologies to Google. It's just the one I had handy. This is in no way specific to them. But a typical experience that someone might go to is they get a wizard like this, and it says, oh, you want to enable SSO for SAML application. Now, if you're not at these conferences all the time, you don't spend all your days thinking about SSO and SAML, you might scratch your head a little bit and be like, SAML? I think I heard about that. But I'm going to ignore that. Oh, select an app for which I want to set up single sign-on. So maybe I'll select GoToMeeting. And the first screen you see is something like this. And I remember the very first time I went through this. I stopped at this screen and stared at it for a couple minutes, and I couldn't make heads or tails of it. I'm like, what am I doing here? What's an entity ID? I'm downloading some stuff. What do I do with these downloads? Unfortunately, there's this little Learn More thing up there, so I remember clicking that. And it walks through these handy steps. This is dedicated steps for GoToMeeting. And it says, oh, OK, so here's this 5-step process I'm going to go through. So I got my bearings a little bit. However, if you actually expand out all those steps, this is what it looks like all expanded out. It's a convenient 35-step process to set up single sign-on to GoToMeeting. I actually went and read the whole SAML spec, which people told me was crazy afterwards. I think I came out more confused than when I went in. But I'm like, OK, I think I know what's going on here. And there's this, as you see, bottom left, there's a whole bunch of steps where you have to sign on to GoToMeeting, and you're downloading things from Google and uploading them to GoToMeeting and doing the reverse and all this copying and pasting. So I'm like, OK. So I start doing that. Maybe I do that stuff on GoToMeeting, and I come back to that. Finally, I'm back to the screen that I stared. This is a day or two later. I'm finally back at this screen. I'm like, OK, I know what to do. I download the stuff. I click Next. The next thing the wizard asks is, give me some basic information. This kind of makes sense. There's the name, some description. It was a little weird that I had to upload the logo and that I had to make sure it was a ping or a GIF of a certain size. So I went through some effort trying to figure out how to resize images. Got through that. And then you get to this next screen, which just says these service provider details. And again, someone who's never been through this before, they're going to be looking at this stuff, and they'll be like, ACS URL, NEDI, what is this? Sign responses? Should I check that? Should I not check that? What happens? I have no idea if these are right or wrong. And then there's some sort of weird mapping things, like name ID to primary email. GoToMeeting is pretty simple. There are some apps where the mapping gets even more complicated. It asks you to map even more things. Let's say the app wants someone's first name. Well, depending on which app it is, they could ask for in any one of these formats or maybe even a different format. So maybe Dropbox might require one format and Salesforce requires another. And I, going through this wizard, have to figure out how do I map to that? Like, how does that work? Anyway, if you get through all that, you finally click finish, and finally it works and you can single sign on. Except that it mostly doesn't. When I was ramping up on this and doing all these exercises, it was a bit, you know that moment where you write code and it actually compiles and runs the first time, and you're like, that never happens. I had the same feeling when I actually got single sign-on to work. It's like, whoa, it worked that time. I didn't have to debug anything. Typically, you get some opaque error like this. And then I'd spend several more minutes, hours, however long it took to figure out what the heck happened. Quite often, there were some I couldn't even figure it out. I would have had to call tech support, and I just gave up at that point. And I had read the entire SAML spec. Like, I know what's going on here. And I missed a step in the instructions. I copied a string, put it in the wrong place. I don't know, dot in the wrong place. This stuff was hard. Finally get through that. If you power through all that, like you finally can get it working. Well, you get it working maybe for about a year, at which point those certificates that you uploaded from the SAML data generally expire. And so a lot of companies go through their annual rite of passage about, oh, single sign-on has broken again, time to rotate the certificate. So this is what I mean by it's hard. There's a lot of pain here, and there's a lot of pain for a lot of people. There's pain for what I call the system administrator. That's the poor person who just went through that experience I described. Because of all this debugging, a real enterprise will typically budget about 1 to 2 weeks to set up single sign-on to just one application. So this becomes incredibly expensive as the number of applications increase. Now, if you want to make this easier, there's a whole bunch of people down in the expo who are happy to sell you products to try to make this a little bit easier for you. And if you happen to be one of those folks, if you're we call it an identity provider, you're providing like some sort of toolkit, you're going to give people a catalog of SaaS apps. And the trouble is, every time you want to add a new entry to that catalog, each one of these applications is a little different. How do you set up this configuration? Do they call it first name? Do they call it given name? So if you're one of these vendors, each time you add something to the catalog, you got to do all this custom configuration. And it's pain for the person who's writing the actual application, the SaaS app. Of course, they would like to get into all these catalogs that the identity providers make available. They can't really do that self-service. They got to say, please add me. And quite often, they see they have bigger things they're worrying about as an application builder. And identity is usually just this thing they get to at the end when someone tells them they need to support single sign-on. And they look at all these standards, and they see OpenID and OAuth and SCIM, and they just sort of go like, identity guys, like, tell me what the heck to do. Like, how am I supposed to put this together? And we don't. We just let them figure it out. And each one does it a little bit differently. So this is where FastFed came in. Like, the whole motivation was we need to make this experience better. We actually want to increase the adoption of federation and less proliferation of these passwords. And you start scratching your heads like, okay, that's a great goal. How are we actually going to do that? Well, one of the key problems we have with the way the existing flow works today is people. That experience I just showed you, this poor administrator is going to an identity provider and a service provider and copying and pasting and downloading and updating and following these 35-step instructions. People are like the worst, most error-prone, unreliable data bus that we could ever choose for exchanging information between two parties. And so you look at this and you're like, why do we have this person in the middle? So really our goal is, how do you get that person out of there? Why don't you just let these machines talk to each other, let them slurp down the information from each other, and just go? And then all the person has to do is maybe point the two parties at each other, say, I approve, I authorize this, please go. And so the group looked at a lot of problems that needed to be solved there. How do these computers talk to each other in the first place? The mechanics of that, there's probably some credential exchange. How do they even discover each other? How do they know what their endpoints are? And how do they, once they can actually talk to each other, how do they understand each other? So, a service provider could offer SAML or OIDC. They could have different user provisioning modes. How does the service provider communicate? This is what I understand. This is what I can do. And so we thought there was probably some need for metadata files. Same thing with the user attributes. I showed you that example of first name and all the different ways to represent it. To get that person out of there, you really need some sort of consensus about, when I'm going to ask for first name, we're all going to agree. This is how we're going to label first name. And some consensus on a shared schema. Some of those are common schemas. So to be clear, what we're not doing, just to make this clear, as part of FastFed, we are not defining a new authentication protocol. So SAML, OpenID Connect, that stuff is going to keep working the same way it works today. We're not replacing those, changing those, adding those. We're not going to force you to change if you happen to have an existing SAML or OpenID Connect endpoint that you're happy with, that it's working, you don't actually have to change that. That's just going to keep working the same way it works. What we are doing is making it easier to discover and use and integrate with those things. And the way we're considering doing that is, first of all, just some new metadata files. You know, if I support OIDC, well, first of all, how do I know you support OIDC? How do I know where to find your configuration? Do you support SCIM? Do you not? Like that sort of connecting those dots together. Some new UX flows, I'll show you an example in a moment. This is all about trying to make it easier for these administrators. So, you know, some APIs and some flows we expect people to implement. And finally, you know, as I mentioned, the service providers are like, they look at this soup of standards and no idea how to put them together. And so we often call them profiles, but these sort of recipes or recommended practices. Like, if you do this, and if we actually succeed in this, and it gets adoption, what do these participants get? If I go back to that slide of the previous pain points, if you're that system administrator, ideally we're going to give you an experience that does take minutes. You know, in real world, you'll have the experience that it looks like you get here as you see all these demos that make Federation look so simple. As an identity provider, you know, today each app is different. As an identity provider, you can actually say, you know, if you're, you know, Ping or Google or whomever, hey, if you are building a FastFed compliant service, here's how you onload. You don't even need to talk to me. Just go click the buttons, and you'll be in. Similarly, if you're one of these application providers, that's great for you. Now you can get into all these catalogs and self-service, and you actually get some guidance on how the heck to do this. You know, hey, be FastFed compliant. So if we actually do this right, this original experience, this 35-step process, ideally becomes this experience I'm going to describe next. And forgive the world's cheesiest mock-ups. But if you imagine you're that enterprise system administrator, and you go to your identity provider, whichever one you've chosen to use, and they'll probably give you some options. You know, do you want to choose an application that you want to set up single sign-in into? Or maybe there's some advanced custom stuff you can do there. So maybe I'd click Salesforce. I'd see a little screen that says, oh, you're about to be redirected to the service provider, Salesforce. They're going to ask you a few questions. So I'll say, OK, cool. I'll click the button. I'll land on that service provider, Salesforce, whatever. They may choose to ask me no questions, except to say, are you sure you want to do this? If they have some configuration options, maybe they'll ask some questions about, like, you know, how do you want to pay for this? How many users do you want? I'll answer a few of those questions, submit. The service provider sends me back home. My identity provider says, you know what, you're almost done. Just got to confirm one last thing. The service provider you want to use, they're going to access the following thing about your users. First name, last name, looks good. OK. I'm going to go ahead and click complete registration. And at that point, I'm done. You know, most identity providers will then let you manage permissions. That's not part of FastFed, but just sort of put it up there to show what the likely end-to-end experience what it would look like. So a very, very different process than that 35-step thing. You'll notice nowhere in there did we say SAML, OIDC, SCIM. It's a very intuitive. You don't have to be an identity expert. You don't have to spend days doing this. And if it does break, hopefully it breaks much, much earlier, like in the beginning of the process, where it simply says, hey, this FastFed endpoint isn't compliant or something like that. And we can have tools that can help make sure service providers actually launch compliant endpoints. So a quick update on the working group status. It's a newer group. If you're going to go look for the draft RFC, you're not going to find one yet. I'm on the hook as the editor for this. I'm shooting for fall of this year. I think we have the next Internet Identity Workshop in the fall, and it'd be great to actually have a draft for that. What we do have is we have some straw man proposals that do have actual flows and metadata and stuff like that, and the debate around that. I think there's definitely going to be some more iterations. And I think in a bit here, I'll start working on that actual draft specification. So finally, if you want to learn more, again, OpenID Foundation, all public. You can go to the page. You can actually, you know, go look at our mailing list, see the debate, see some of the documents that are being exchanged if you'd like. But that's the end of the presentation. Any questions or anything? My hope is that if we actually get this right, by the time we all get together at the Cloud Identity Summit next year, everyone will be asking about FastFed compliance, and we support it, and why don't you support it, and things like that.
On the FastFed, on this one right here, if you are the SAML and you know there's two either artifact profile or the post profile, how are you going to deal with certificate exchange if you work on the post profile?
So how do the certificates get exchanged for the various SAML
Right.
nodes?
Okay, so this one is fast federation. So you don't care either OpenID Connect or SAML underneath that, right? But if we go with the SAML, there will be a artifact or post profile. If you go post profile, there will be a certificate exchange between the IDP and SP.
Yeah.
So how it is going to play with that?
Well, if we actually succeed in letting the identity provider and the service provider speak to each other programmatically, we expect that's not a one-time relationship. That is an ongoing permissions, because you're right, certificates need to be rotated. Even as something as simple as I updated my icon for my service, and I would like that to get up. This is an ongoing thing. Yeah, that's a good question.
I have a question on SCIM. So some vendors claims they support SCIM already. So like ping identity, I think they support it. Are they follow the FastFed spec, or or they are doing some proprietary implementation?
Yeah, ping very much is. The working group has, I think, a really good spectrum of identity providers. And you're right, ping supports it going outbound. The trouble is not too many service providers actually accept it. Like that's where kind of the gap is. And I think if there's one risk for this adoption, the thing that worries me most, it's we don't necessarily have enough voices from the SaaS service provider side of the equation giving us feedback there. And I think that's one area where I'd like to reach out as the spec proceeds and get more feedback from those service providers. Because they definitely have to do work to support this. Yeah.
So I guess one of my questions is, is this mainly around the trust that's being established between the two entities, the service provider and the IDP, or is any of it user flow? Because for example, with Google, you can have where certain IP addresses accept federation and certain ones don't. That would be a way of locking it down to a specific area and giving the user a normal login when they're not coming from that IP, or Salesforce where you break the login completely or just let it go through. There's a lot of different things that you can go as far as the user flows, as far as authentication. How is that being figured into this?
What we're really focusing on at the beginning is this acute pain point of just setting up that initial configuration exchange. If we declare victory on that and get that one right, then then we could keep going for sure. Yeah, there's more pain points always around the corner.
My question was actually a follow-up or piggyback in the last one. Who is currently working on this, both from the IDP and SP side? Like, how much buy-in are you seeing or interest right now from the IDPs and SPs?
Yeah, oh geez, I remember off the top of my head all the folks that are in it. I know Microsoft, Oracle, VMware, Emily's right behind you. Google, although I haven't heard from them for a bit, but they're definitely in there. I think most of the major players. I didn't actually say I work for Amazon. And so we definitely want people to be able to use our services easier. We're in.
In the flow that you showed that was kind of started from the IDP side to connect to the relying party, do you guys have any example flows if you started from the opposite direction? Like I just signed up for a new service and I have an IDP over here that
I didn't put it up here for
to
time, but it's you can imagine it's very similar. You start at the service and it says, hey, do you want to enable single sign-on? And you can select maybe from some common identity providers or specify your own, and then just the same flow just kicks off. Yeah. All right.
Last call for questions. Again, for those of you that have been working with us throughout the afternoon, part of the reason for this sharing is to get more collaboration into the work groups. So you can find that on the OpenID Foundation website. And if there's no other questions, I want to thank you for attending this session. We're going to be having, the next session will be on the Financial API Working Group. at the OpenID Foundation. How about a round of applause for our presenter?
Thank you.